Public CEO Report is a podcast that provides insights about the public sector and public policy for the benefit of decision makers and leaders powering our communities. I'm your host, Ryder Todd Smith, and today we're joined by Christopher Skinnell, a partner at Nielsen Merksamer, and Douglas Johnson, president of National Demographics Corporation. Chris and Doug, welcome to the Public CEO Report.
Thanks, Ryder. Happy to be here.
Great to have you back. You guys are veterans. You're our first repeat guest. Congratulations.
Oh, honor.
A milestone in our pathway towards achieving Joe Rogan levels of fame on podcasting. All right. So we're here to talk about redistricting, right? We're in the middle of the fray. And we had our podcast earlier this year. We had a conversation about redistricting, but I think I'll have my capable editors provide some links and maybe a link somewhere in a video that'll point to the prior podcast we did together. But having said that, Doug, could you just real quick comment on where we're at right now in the redistricting process and why public agencies should be aware of this or care about it, in particular, why cities and counties and special districts should care?
Sure. We are right in the middle of it at this point. We passed a big milestone on Thursday, so 6 days ago, when the federal government released the 2020 census data. So that, of course, is months late. It was supposed to be out in March, but has finally been released. Of course, in California, for most jurisdictions, that's not actually the redistricting data. California being the unique place that we are, the state is going to alter that data by moving the state prison population and having them counted at their last known home address. So we're still a few weeks away from getting our official redistricting data for most jurisdictions in the state. But that was a big milestone to finally have that come out, and most jurisdictions are well into their hearing process and ready to jump into the mapping process as soon as the official redistricting data is released.
And Chris, there's really, so first of all, let's take a big 32,000 foot perspective here. Who all is looking at having to redistrict we know the state's going through redistricting process and they'll have to draw new assembly lines and Senate lines and whatnot. But what about on the local government level, right? So who all is facing this reality of redistricting?
Well, pretty much everybody. Historically, almost every county has had districts, and so they're all going through this process. They're rushing towards the December 15th deadline. In fact, at this point, it's all 58. 10 years ago, there was one holdout, but now it's all 58. Also, city councils. We've seen, I don't know, what is it, Doug, couple hundred cities move from at-large voting to city council districts in the last 10 years. And so they're all having to go through this process, even though they may have done it, say, even as recently as 2 years ago. They're having to go through the process again because when those lines were drawn even 2 years ago, they were based on 2010 data. And so, even though the districts themselves are new, the underlying data were not. And so it's still necessary for them to go and evaluate whether those districts are still population balanced and meet all of the other criteria. And then school districts, the same thing. We've seen dozens, if not scores, of school districts move to trustee areas and special districts as well. So it's 500-600 local governments probably up and down the state doing redistricting all at the same time. Slightly different deadlines, but still all a breakneck pace because they've all got meetings on the same day and at the same time, and it's quite the process.
So real quick, could you also speak to this timeline and how it applies? So counties and other cities that I think the date is, if they have June primaries or elections, they're needing to finish this redistricting process, meaning adopting new maps by December 15th. And if they otherwise don't have elections until November of 2022, then they have until roughly mid-April to get through this process?
April 17th. And schools are February 28th of next year, assuming that they have November elections. Actually, regardless of when their elections are. And then special districts are sometime mid-May. But there are a few sort of exceptions scattered throughout the various codes in California. So there are some special districts that have a November 1st, 2021 deadline. So we'll get the data in, early October maybe, and have all of 6 weeks to go through the whole process. And there's possible legislation pending that would fix that, but this being California, it probably won't get passed until everybody's already, rushed through something anyway.
Right.
And there are some other counties and cities that have their own sort of unique deadlines, but the December deadline for counties and the April one for cities are kind of the defaults for most jurisdictions.
Right. Doug, did you want to comment on that?
I was just going to add to Chris mentioned the bill that might give these November 1st special districts a little more time. Of course, Sacramento being Sacramento, with one hand they giveth and the other they take away. The newest version of that bill that actually Chris's firm just shared with me recently is they would give them more time, but the special districts whose current deadline is May would move up to April and jam everyone into that April 17th deadline. So we'll see if that bill goes anywhere. It lives and then it dies, and it's classic Sacramento.
Yeah. Yep. As the world turns up there in Sacramento.
Right.
Any other legislation that's looming out there that I know previously there was talk about trying to extend some of these deadlines to accommodate the delay in the census data. There's been some hope that was held out for that, some other changes. Any of that looming out there that we don't have any insights on yet, or did something pass since we last did our podcast?
Nothing comprehensive. There have been a few sort of one-off bills for specific districts and that sort of thing, but the bill that Doug is talking about that just got amended, that was the bill that we'd all hoped would have some extensions and push back deadlines and everything, and it really doesn't. It's a very targeted bill. A lot of it's focused on the state commission and sorting out their timing, and the stuff related to local governments are pretty minor. Except for that one piece that would push back the November 1st special districts.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of calls because the state redistricting commission has asked the state Supreme Court for an extension of a couple of weeks. And so all the local jurisdictions have gotten their hopes up that gives them 2 more weeks as well. And unfortunately, it doesn't. That action is only for the state redistricting commission, and whatever the court does won't help anyone else.
And I think I should have opened this too early on, but for the context of our audience to understand the expertise that you two bring, they obviously could watch the prior podcast. But Chris, could you talk a little bit about your background work, what you do in California around election law, and how many agencies you're providing legal counsel to regarding district formation or redistricting work, say this current cycle?
Yeah, so Nielsen Merksamer generally is a political and election law firm. That's kind of the area that we practice in, general government law and litigation, et cetera. But one of our specialties going back 4 decades is redistricting and voting rights law. We litigate voting rights cases, fortunately not usually related to maps that we've advised on. It's usually maps that were adopted without us. I should say always so far. But we also, have a big practice advising local jurisdictions primarily on the steps of either adopting district boundaries in the first place, because of the California Voting Rights Act. There's been a lot of that in the last decade, or redrawing the lines after each census. And so this cycle, in the last cycle, we represented probably 100 plus jurisdictions. A lot of them were school districts, et cetera, that were moving to districts. So far this time around, we've probably got, I want to say 30, 40, maybe 50 jurisdictions, and more continue to trickle in as it dawns on them that they're up against deadlines.
Right.
But we've got, I would say 10 counties and a whole bunch of cities. We're also out of state doing the New Mexico Citizen Redistricting Committee, and a bunch of school districts, special districts, all up and down the state. And so I think it's safe to say that we're probably the leading firm doing this type of work in California, and have been for decades.
Yeah. And then very good. And then Doug, how about your firm? I know, so I guess in the context for people to understand, usually when you go after these processes, you'll hire you'll have some sort of legal counsel. You'll have a demographer, which is what NDC does. And then sometimes, especially these days with the passage of the Fair Maps Act, you'll have an outreach firm, which is, full disclosure, something Tripepi Smith is doing with over 20 local government agencies. But Doug, talk about your kind of footprint and the demography work you're doing.
Yeah, well, we're kind of for about 30 years now, we've been essentially Nielsen Merksamer's sibling in this redistricting world. NDC handling the demographic side and Nielsen Merksamer handling the legal side. And as you noted, in the recent years, we've added a third sibling of Tripepi Smith working with us on many of these projects. But yes, we've been doing this since 1979, working with all kinds of local jurisdictions, everything from the state of Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission to the Monterey Peninsula Airport District and everyone in between. This year we have a 12-person team, and actually we're about to go to 15 people just to handle all the jurisdictions, and from Nevada County up north to Imperial Beach down south. We are working with well over 100 jurisdictions of all types and shapes and sizes across the state. So we love this thing. It's really our bread and butter and our main focus, and so we do a lot of it, and are still getting calls from jurisdictions that are just waking up to the need to do this and realizing that we're late and everyone's getting booked up. So,
that's right.
If they're watching this and haven't hired a team yet, they need to call someone soon.
So let's talk about that real quick. That was one of the other things I want to cover. We're recording. It's mid-August right now. I think it's August 17th or 18th, and the census data has just been released a few days ago. That, as you noted, that data has to go through a readjustment for redistribution of the prison population in the state of California. So mid-August, we're looking at December adoption. If you're a December adoption deadline organization, and I draw a distinction between those and say city side or whatnot, the April deadline, where should you be at in the process right now, generally speaking?
Ideally, you've already held at least one public hearing and have your website up and running, and you've got your demographer. And I mean, the process should really be underway at this point, because you basically want to use the time from now until December to be drawing maps now that the data are coming out. And so the hope is ideally that you've already laid all the groundwork for that and you're ready to hit the ground running. I think all of the counties are pretty much moving along. I don't know about all of the cities. There may be one or two out there that have December deadlines and just haven't focused, but I think you want to be a fair ways down the road at this point.
Yeah, particularly if you're looking at doing an independent commission or advisory commission, you still have to form a commission to make that process happen. That in and of itself can take some own sweet time, and now you're really up against a tight deadline.
That's right. Yeah, you've got to go through the whole appointment process just to get the commission set up, and then because they're not public officials already, they usually require more training. Even simple stuff like Brown Act, public records, all of that stuff, but then all on top of that, all of the law related just to redistricting and the process and everything. So it's more time consuming. And if you haven't set up a committee or a commission at this point, you're kind of up against it if you have a December deadline, I think.
Yeah. And then for those that have an April deadline, they obviously have another 4-month reprieve, right? So they're roughly 4 months behind, which means if they want to be doing an independent commission, obviously we sooner urgency now, but not as quite the crisis point at this time yet, but they should move with haste is my sense.
I agree. I wouldn't say quite 4 months, because that stretch right there during the holidays, basically December, is, either you've got Doug and his team and our team so busy with counties that you can't devote a lot of time to it, or you've got the holidays.
Right.
And people you don't have meetings, you don't have people focused. And so there's a stretch there. It's less than 4 months of actual working time, I would say.
Yeah. All right. So we've gotten thrown some curveballs in this process. Obviously, the delay in the census data is a huge curveball induced by a pandemic in terms of the delay. And now that pandemic has roared back a bit, certainly with the Delta variant coming into the fore. Normally, there's a lot of in-person events that go along with these processes. What are you guys seeing in terms of the space out there with shifts back to virtual, or how agencies are handling this dynamic environment of in-person versus not in person, and the public engagement and public meeting requirements?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in first and just say, in just the last 2 weeks, we've had 4 of our clients cancel all in-person meetings and move back to pure virtual meetings. We've had others that have really worked hard to go hybrid and those that actually put in the work to plan for hybrid hearings have been very thankful recently. One city had hybrid meetings all set up and then put the word out of saying, well, if you show up, we'll let you in, but we really want you to be virtual because of the Delta variant being big in their city. So hybrid, I mean, Ryder, as you know well, hybrid meetings are a real technical challenge and take some serious planning and tech support. So they are tough, but we are seeing more moving to virtual certainly in the last couple of weeks, and we expect a bunch more to do that in the next few weeks as well. So some are still trying to hold it out, but you know, one of the big challenges is if you're masked up in person, it's almost worse than being virtual. You know, you can't see people's facial expressions, you can't tell which elected official is speaking. And so done right, the virtual it can be very effective, but it takes a lot of work to do it right.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. Chris, do you have any additional comments you want to make about that, or maybe some comments about legal considerations around those issues? Or, you know, partly my understanding is also a lot of this virtual stuff is being allowed under an ongoing state of emergency order from the governor, which I assume continues, right? So obviously we're able to move forward. So we're in decent shape on that front, at least my perception of things.
Well, my understanding, unless it's changed recently, and I haven't heard anything, is that expires at the end of September. So there's a little bit of a window in the next 6 weeks where that's okay. And I think there's an effort or there's a proposal to adopt legislation that would continue it, but you know, we'll see. They basically have a few weeks left of the session, so you know, things tend to fall by the wayside in August in the legislature. I don't know how that'll go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree with Doug. I think it's a little bit all over the map. There are some jurisdictions that are moving back to virtual. There are some that are still doing in-person meetings. So it's kind of varies jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Yeah, I, you know, first of all, to Doug's point about the executing on hybrid meetings, you know, I've seen some real heroes out there, frankly, on the technical front. I think of like Fresno County, where I'm doing some work in this space, and they've got their AV team there is just amazing. And they have this whole solution in a box where they roll it out in a big truck, and they can roll this thing in on wheels, and it's got multiple cameras, and it's basically like setting up what they have inside their supervisor chambers there where they normally do meetings, and they have it in a box. And so their ability to bring around a mobile solution, actually go to venues throughout the community is impressive. And they're able to execute hybrid in that process. But it's, you know, it's a big county with big resources, and it's a lot of work to get done. So, and my other observation would be hybrid is, as Doug hinted at, is one of the more difficult arrangements because you are dealing with that people in the room and people on the far side. And in some ways, if we were to just go pure Zoom only, for example, or whatever, insert solution X for online meeting facilitation, it would almost just be easier because at least we're all unified in that same experience and kind of design an experience around that.
Yeah. On that point, Common Cause has given a number of presentations, and they make a very interesting point, which is if you're going to go hybrid, don't just have the camera in the back of the room. You know, they really emphasize that if you're going to have a hybrid option, each of the elected officials needs their own camera because the speakers who are speaking virtually want to be just like a speaker in the room and able to see the reactions of the elected officials to their comments, not just hey, I think that red dot is Supervisor X and I think the blue dot is Supervisor Y. It just doesn't work. So that has been a big challenge, and you're exactly right. There have been some true audiovisual heroes through this that have really made it work.
Yeah. And there's always the questions that come up about the digital divide and access to these meetings. And if you don't have internet or you don't have a speedy computer or high-speed internet, your ability to participate is limited. I know, you know, some of that gets mitigated by having dial-in options, so you at least get the audio experience, which is better than nothing, certainly. And most of the information is being conveyed in audio. And even with that experience, you can still get on some of the platforms language interpretation in your audio experience as well. So some of those experiences ultimately are actually better. And they are more convenient from that perspective. I think the other thing we've generally seen is, yes, the online experiences can be, there are maybe members of the community who don't have access to the internet that can't benefit from those, or maybe they'd have to go to a local library and be able to get access to computers to see some of that stuff. We've seen some really great community-based organizations that have helped bring some of those meetings and make them available for their membership. And that's really great to see. We love it when the community-based organizations get involved and help bring members of the public into the process in collaborative fashion, right? But then there's other ways that people can submit. I mean, I've always heard NDC talk about, like, if you want to draw something take a paper map that we have available, pick it up at the local agency office and draw on that map and submit it. You can do that in a in-person experience and bypass the internet entirely if you want. Is that a fairly accurate description? And Chris, is that also one of the elements?
A napkin, right, Doug?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, the more detail, the better. But it's very true. There are ways of addressing those concerns, and I always remember seeing how a community can overcome this in San Rafael, when in the Canal District they had a new immigrant-dominated neighborhood, very little internet access, so the local kind of community service organization got 30 people in the room, and sure, they didn't have internet access, they didn't have tech-savvy skills, but one of them did, and a college kid sat down at the terminal, and all 30 people collaborated on drawing this map on the tool. So, yes, it is a challenge, but it's a challenge that can be addressed and conquered in various ways. And that was, that's really what we want. And on the flip side of it is the virtual access is bringing in an audience that really is a rich audience to participate in this process. Families with young kids who could never make it to a council meeting, people who work and can't get to the council chambers. We're getting voices that we didn't traditionally hear, rather than just the people who are at the council meeting and speak on every agenda item. So it has been a challenge. It does, without a doubt, have its challenges built in, but it also has some significant benefits of, the parents being able to participate in the meeting while sitting next to their kid who's eating dinner. That's a whole new world. And not having to sit through the 3-hour agenda item before theirs too.
Yeah, I agreed on that front. And I would observe in most of the public agencies we have a chance to work with, they've generally seen public engagement increase in their meetings as a result of moving to hybrid or purely virtual meetings. They've just more people calling in and commenting on stuff. So, yeah, it's a fair and important point to raise in that. How about in just terms of record keeping and staying in compliance? I mean, it seems to me like it's relatively straightforward. Just record everything and make sure you have good audio and video of it all. But any comments you guys want to make about that?
I think just making sure you have your website up and running, and that you've got all of the materials on there that you need. I think having that sort of one-stop shopping is a valuable tool for the public. That just to go and find out everything they need to know, and also, at least for jurisdictions that are working with NDC and some of the others, having the online mapping tools available through that website is I think a great thing, to allow people to help. I throughout this process, it's always valuable when someone comes in and complains about the map, that you've either have already or something that's being proposed. Say, okay, well then you do it. You go fix it. You draw a map that you think makes sense and submit it, and then let's see. And it's, I think, beneficial for people to play around with that and understand how the trade-offs have to get made. That it's not always an easy thing to do. So I think having the website and connected to it, those mapping tools, I think are a valuable thing.
Yeah. And this already ties into, what we're talking about the jurisdictions being up and running. We just put together an agenda packet for the Pasadena Redistricting Task Force. And even though we don't have any official census data yet, we're just working with our firm's ballpark estimates of the numbers. We already have 11 maps submitted. Some are neighborhood maps and some are full citywide maps. So that's getting people, into it. Yes, they'll have to fine tune their maps when we get official census data, but they're already engaged in discussion about where might the lines move and moving along that path, especially as they're a December deadline. So they'll be really ready to jump and have some of the neighborhood pieces in place even before that official redistricting data is released.
Yeah, Doug, your firm did something unique to try to compensate for the lack of the census data being available, which was you used your own algorithms to make some estimates about population. And now you're getting a chance to see how reasonably accurate your estimates proved to be as a result of the census data being released. How would you grade yourself?
We've just been doing a little look back and with the caveat that our team always says, which is the only thing that's guaranteed about every estimate is that it will be wrong. our estimates have come out fairly well compared to other estimates. Actually, the Census Bureau did its own estimates, kind of that they use for quality checking. And in 60% of California cities, we were closer to the actual census count than the Census Bureau was with its estimates. Kudos to the California Department of Finance. Their city totals were closer to the official census city totals than ours in about 60% of the time. So we beat them about 40% of the time. But of course, they take the easy route. They just do the city total. They don't break it down within the city. So, so we can't look at those details. But yes, of course, given this year's census data, there's a larger random factor to it than ever before. So we haven't been dead on. And we are seeing, where we're seeing shortcomings do tend to be largely in the Latino neighborhoods, where the counts have not measured up as high as expected. So that has thrown off some of our estimates. But all in all, we're close enough that it's fine tuning that's needed in most cases. They don't have to start over from scratch. And so places like Pasadena are a step ahead of the process at this point.
So, and I'm curious, does that suggest that there was just an undercount in the census process for those Latino neighborhoods, or does that suggest that just what we perceived as the high growth Latino population moderated its growth over the course of the last decade?
That's a good question, and we don't really know for sure. It's likely that it's more on the undercount side than the overestimate side, but there's no real way to confirm that for sure.
Right. Interesting. So agencies have a lot of requirements. We were just talking about the work that's going on in Pasadena, for example, where they've done a yeoman's amount of outreach effort on the upfront side. I think they did 6 or 7 community workshops, including an all virtual one including one that was all in Spanish, in order to do some outreach ahead of time. So some of this is being driven by the Fair Maps Act. Could you just comment briefly on some couple key things that show up on that front that you want to clue some folks into, and what agencies can be doing about that right now?
Yeah, Chris, you want to take that first?
Go ahead, Doug.
I think there are a couple pieces of the Fair Maps Act. One is all the outreach and requirements on that side. For a lot of jurisdictions, they were already doing all of that. Reaching out to every good government and kind of community organization in the city. Historically, there would always be a few that had a lot of other things going on, so they would kind of not put much focus on this. And so the Fair Maps Act has kind of pushed everyone put a lot of focus and emphasis on this project side. The bigger shock and the bigger change is in the mapping criteria, and that hasn't really kicked in, where, of course, every jurisdiction is made up of elected officials who worked very hard to get elected to those positions and got a lot of voters who thought they should be there. And so historically, keeping each elected official with the ability to run again has been a priority. Now in cities and counties, that is a very, very low consideration in the statutory list. And those that create independent commissions can't consider it at all. So that's for a number of jurisdictions who followed the rules last time and adopted legal maps last time, but now their maps are going to have to be overhauled completely. That's a big shock to the system, and can be very, it's very personal to the elected officials, so it has a big distraction effect on the elected body's ability to focus on all the other things going on these days. So we'll see how well they can manage that, but it does certainly shift the playing ground for the cities and the counties who are going through this process.
Yeah, no doubt. Chris, you got any additional comments you want to make about that?
Well, just sort of along those lines. Historically, you would start with the existing map and just tinker as little as you could to make it work, right? And if you were within the 10% deviation, you might just leave them alone. And there may still be jurisdictions that land there when all is said and done, right? Because they drew their maps in a way that they kind of already took those communities of interest into account, and they follow natural boundaries. And a lot of maps are actually may survive this process, but A lot won't, and even the ones that do are going to have to go through the entire public hearing process and make sure, they're going to have to confirm that these lines really are compliant with the new law. So it is a little bit of a shock. I did have a city council member, when we laid out the 4 hearings and all of the whole process, say, we just did this a few years ago. Do we really have to do all of this? The short answer now is, yeah, you do. 10 years ago, you might not have had to, but yeah, this time you do. So it's a lot. And I think related to that, sort of the combined effect of having everybody doing it at once, it sort of compounds it, right? I mean, you have a city, but then also the same county, and then, the local school district, and they're all doing, going through this process simultaneously, or at least somewhat. There's a lot to pay attention to.
Right.
Yeah, it's a lot of moving. It's a lot of moving parts. You could have one of our hearings or one of our workshops we worked on happened to coincide coincidentally with the state commission having their own hearing in a nearby area, right? So you ended up with conflicting workshops on that schedule, and certainly to your point, like concurrent with that, you could have a county and a city who are both doing these things simultaneously, and the public is confused about which one is the one that's being addressed at that point in time, and show up at a meeting expecting to talk about the county, and it turns out it's the city themselves. So what is already an esoteric every 10-year process is even more complicated when you have multiple jurisdictions simultaneously going through the process itself.
I know. And just on the legal front too, the other interesting thing we're seeing is historically, the California Voting Rights Act has really only been aimed at cities that are 10,000 population or more. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but just in the midst of everything else going on, that's been blown through too. So we're seeing, Solvang and Buellton and Grover Beach having to go to by-district elections, and these tiny little jurisdictions are really struggling with, how are we going to draw districts that only have a couple of hundred registered voters in them, and how are we going to be sure that someone's willing to run in those districts? But in the midst of all the Fair Maps Act legal changes, we also have the California Voting Rights Act continuing to churn away as these lawyers send out the demand letters and force jurisdictions to switch.
Yeah, that very true, very true. Doug, how many? I think we talked about this last time we got together too, but just for some more context with folks, what was the general shift over the last decade from cities that had by-district elections to where they are these days?
Yeah, before the California Voting Rights Act passed in 2002, there were 29 cities that had district elections in California, and they were mostly the big ones, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And then there were some smaller ones that had been hit by federal Voting Rights Act concerns, Watsonville and Hollister, or Watsonville and Salinas and places like that. But it was only 29. At our last count, I know we're over 160. And I think we might be over 170 cities now. So, from 29 to over 170 in 15 years, because the law was kind of suspended until 2006 by a court. So it's a massive shift in an insanely short period of time. And of course, all those jurisdictions are now dealing with redistricting for the first time. And so one thing we talked about last time, and it remains true, is 10 years ago, we had maybe 150, 175 California local governments that had to redistrict. And as Chris said, mostly the counties, and then a scattering of others. Now we're looking at 500 that have to redistrict this time. And pretty much all of them are on a early 2022 deadline. Before, we had a bunch that had off-year elections, so they would actually wait until the following year to do it. So this is a huge shift in workload and crunch time, and number of jurisdictions impacted.
Yeah, it's a mess.
That's a good point. Under perhaps appreciated piece of this is the law that the legislature passed a few years ago that basically forces cities to move to even-year elections. Historically, there were a lot of cities, particularly in Southern California and LA, that did off-year, November of odd years was their election date. And so it sort of staggered it, and that, obviously, as Doug said, helped with the redistricting. And now, because of that law, which passed, I think, in 2014, most cities throughout the state have pushed to November of even years. So they're all stacked at the same time. So I think that's another factor in all of this.
Yeah, it's almost like just for the sake of getting through this process and also giving the public a chance to focus on one particular type at a time, they should give special districts and school districts like a 2-year reprieve and have them do this in 2022, 23 or something like that, just to allow agencies to get through and to flatten the curve, so to speak, to use pandemic nomenclature of the spike that's coming in with all the redistricting work that has to get done.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a couple of jurisdictions that for quirky reasons don't have to redistrict in this crunch time, and their rates are much lower than everyone else's rates are, that's for sure, because the cost of us addressing all these needs in such a short time is so high.
And look at it this way, Doug. You said we're up to 170 cities. That means there's still another 300 or so to move through for the next redistricting cycle.
Exactly. I used to say, but essentially everyone getting hit by CVRA was 10,000 or above, but now that's gone, and that opens up a whole new pool of potential target cities, unless someone finally steps in. And neither the legislature nor the courts have indicated any interest in putting a limit on these things.
So one of the things that I get asked a lot, and we've seen this come up in the work we've been doing, is kind of where and how should elected officials be involved in the process? And of course, this is subject to other guidance and considerations and what's being said. But do you have any thoughts about that? And clearly elected officials, and where there's not an independent commission, they ultimately are adopting whatever the maps are. So they're involved at that point, certainly. But I'm also talking about the outreach process and related elements like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'll start, Chris, with you if you have any thoughts about those issues, because that could be a real point of just tension, I think, in what is supposed to be a very apolitical process becoming very political and raising concerns.
I mean, I think I guess I'm sort of two minds about them participating in the outreach. On the one hand, most of the clients that I'm working with, it's handled at the staff level or with an outside consultant like Tripepi Smith. But at the same time, those council members are well connected in their communities. And so if you really want people to turn out and participate, they're well positioned to do that. And so I think, there's some value to that. As far as it being an apolitical process, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, the Fair Maps Act is meant to temper the politics some, but I'm not sure it's meant to do away with it entirely. And realistically, I don't think it could.
Right.
So I'm not, obviously the city council members or boards of supervisors, these are folks who know their communities. They know what the communities of interest are. They're going to be important players in the process, quite apart from their formal role of adopting the map lines. But they're going to give valuable feedback also. And you can debate back and forth how much of that is self-interested or not, but it's not always, honestly. I mean, in my experience, I think it's important to have them involved. Maybe not in the day-to-day nuts and bolts of every single step, but sort of aware of the process and how it's playing out and providing useful feedback.
Yeah, I would certainly concur that one of the most effective things that they can do is simply tell their communities about what's going on with this process and educate them and get them engaged. Like to me, that's kind of a no-brainer, and it's super helpful for them to be involved in that process. And I agree, like they have good networks that reach out into the community, and a lot of the people that they know who will respond to them are more engaged in what's going on the issues. And so you take an esoteric subject like redistricting, and that's where you're going to find some people who are going to come to the table and want to be active collaborators in the process of drawing great maps.
Right. Yeah, and we always make the point, and Ryder, your team has put together a lot of these materials that, as Chris was saying, the jurisdiction can do outreach, but a social media message or an email from the city of blank has one impact. If the elected officials then take that official outreach and forward it to their personal lists and their campaign lists, then they're forwarding, it's a message from council member X going to someone who has spent hours volunteering and knocking on doors for council member X. That's going to really get their attention much more effectively. So without a doubt, they can be a bullhorn to amplify out the kind of official messages going out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one other thing that has kind of come up in the course of the conversations too in our workshops that I'd love for you to comment on, which is the Fair Maps Act was rather prescriptive and even prioritized the criteria for drawing districts, which really narrowed what some might perceive as, nefarious activity to try to organize districts under certain criteria. Could you guys comment on that? I mean, like, there's not a lot of wiggle room to some extent in terms of how crazy your districts are going to get drawn.
Chris?
I think that the ranked criteria, they're obviously modeled on the state commission criteria from Prop 11 and Prop 20. And I think they're well-intentioned. I think they're a little bit one size fits all. They're not always going to give you actually the best map from a pure representational perspective. Now, I understand the rationale behind them, and maybe, the trade-off is worth that. But I do think there are some jurisdictions, and I find this particularly in cities probably more than anywhere else, because cities have very irregular boundaries. So they can have some very strange mapping issues as a result of that. Sometimes it creates some real problems. And you'll get members of the public who say, this doesn't make any sense, but there's not really a whole lot you can do about it.
Right.
I guess the bottom line is I understand where they were coming from. I do wish there were a bit more flexibility. I don't think it's always as beneficial as people think it's going to be.
Yeah, to Chris's point, it's definitely one size fits all, kind of an idealist view of the process. We have one city that, they had 1/4 of the population lives on one side of the freeway, clearly divided from the rest of the city, made total logical sense. It was kind of both, everything over there is kind of in the hills, similar housing, so perfect. It made a district. And we drew that district under the old rules, and they adopted it. And everyone understood it's everything east of the freeway. But in one point, the city border comes down to the freeway. And so now it's actually two different pieces that are not separated by another district, but they are separated by unincorporated territory that work together. So now the Fair Maps Act has said this very logical district that makes total sense to everyone who lives there is illegal. And now we have to find some way of, redrawing the map so that everything's contiguous. And it wasn't like they were gerrymandering with one map, one district wrapping around another. It was just the odd shape of the city. It carved this area out, and it made total sense. And then, we have military bases and university dorms that play havoc with the numbers. And so the Fair Maps Act kind of handcuffs the ability to deal with those issues. So we're working with those jurisdictions to figure out how do we solve those unique problems that so many California jurisdictions face, because it is quite a smorgasbord of situations when you look at all the hundreds or actually thousands of local governments in this state.
Well, this is the constant battle of highly prescriptive legislation, is it doesn't accommodate for the exceptions out there, and there's always exceptions, right? There's always somebody who's going to break the model, so to speak, and cause it to get flipped on its head.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's part and parcel of a broader issue in redistricting, which is a lot of the time these rules are designed for large states with lots of resources like the state of California, and they don't think about how they work at the local level. And it's a similar issue, actually, a lot of the case law under the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court hands down all these decisions saying you have to do this and you have to do this and you have to do this. And it's extremely time and labor and resource intensive, which is, one thing for the California state legislature. It's another thing for a city with 5,000 people in it, and there's very little thought given to that distinction in a lot of these rules. And I think the Fair Maps Act is a piece of that, right? Applying the Fair Maps Act in LA is probably not going to be the end of the world, because it's so big, it has so many communities of interest that you piece together. There's so much going on that there's still going to be a fair amount of discretion. In small jurisdictions, that's not always the case. So.
Well, perhaps we'll get through this cycle, and 2 years from now, there'll be some discussions about lessons learned from the redistricting process and how to tweak, adjust, or fix up and make some further evolution of the Fair Maps Act or its next iteration, whatever that may be.
Certainly.
Fingers crossed.
So let's, I want to kind of turn the corner here on the conversation and come to a wrapper conversation, which is creating a kind of a defensible process and redistricting plan. You guys have some insights. At the end of the day, you're going to adopt this plan. Hopefully nobody sues you for it, right? But there may be the case that happens, and you want to look your community in the eye and say you did the best job possible and create a map that's defensible. So, any observations and comments either through the process or legal nuances that are worth sharing here for organizations to consider as they face that prospect at the end of the day?
I mean, I think it's the same advice it always was. It's just taken on new urgency, which is record. Build your record. Make sure that you've done all of the record keeping. So that you can, when someone challenges the map and says, this is illegal for the following reasons, you can say, no, we did it for this reason, and you have that backup that you can point to. That's going to be crucial. It always has been up to a point, but before, when jurisdictions had discretion, there was a lot more, wiggle room. Now it's important to, back it up. Why was that community of interest split? The legislature has said in the Fair Maps Act, keep communities of interest together to the extent practicable. Well, it's not always going to be practicable, but I think you need to explain and have a record for why in some cases it wasn't kept together, and so I think that's going to be the far and away the most important piece of having a defensible map.
Okay. Doug, any other comments?
Yeah, building that record, Chris is exactly right, and then elected officials kind of accepting the new reality. When this law passed, I gave an estimate that 20 to 40 council members were going to not be able to run again or be forced to run against their fellow council member because of the state's prescriptions. At this point, I think I might have been a little low in that number. And the state authors of the bill say, it's the will of the people. Districts are for the people. If they have to run against each other, so be it. What they missed and what they don't understand is that it's not necessarily the two council members will have to run against each other. It's a council member will be in a district that's on the wrong election year and will simply be forced off the council. It won't be up to the voters. It'll be the lines just sending them home. So this all relates to this one size fits all, approach. In Los Angeles or in Congress, the council members move to get into their district. In Buellton, the council members aren't going to move to stay in office. They're doing it out of a civic duty, and they're not going to sell their house because of that. So it doesn't really work so well, and will have a big impact. I don't know about in Buellton, but in a number of jurisdictions, certainly we'll see council members paired that the law just requires it now.
Mm-hmm.
I think another sort of related but underappreciated fact is that it does have an impact on the voters if you make radical changes to the districts, right? Because you can end up with a lot of voters that get switched from one election cycle to the other. And so some of them are voting twice in a row. And then there are those people who end up having to skip an entire election cycle because they got moved from, they were supposed to vote the next election. Now they got moved to a different district, and now their new district doesn't have a vote in that next election cycle. So it isn't really just about the current council members. It does have impact on a significant number of voters. And that was always a big piece of why, it made sense to start from the current districts and try to use those as the building blocks and make adjustments as possible. So you minimize that impact on the electorate.
Well, plus just people become familiar with what the district looks like and they know where it is, and they, as a comms person, I will tell you it's hard to get people fired up and engaged in understanding how government works in general. So getting them to understand the nuance of where their district is and then to rip that carpet out from underneath them, that certainly has its own challenge. I mean, one of the things we always note in our proposals and conversations with agencies is, our engagement theoretically can come to an end once you adopt the maps, but there's a whole voter outreach and education process that could go on after that. Certainly if you just went to district elections, but even if you're redistricting and moving the map around significantly, there's a whole component there, starting with educating the members of the public who might be interested in running for office to know what district are they actually in these days, and would it therefore behoove them to be running in that district to represent those constituencies. So it's an important issue, to say the least.
I think a little bit of a sort of twist is we talk a lot about communities of interest, but the fact of the matter is that over time, these districts can become a community of interest, right? Because if you have people who are organized and to campaign within the districts as they exist, they build networks, they build their campaign structure with that in mind. And, it does become a common community in that respect. And so, completely redrawing the lines from scratch undermines at least that political community of interest.
Mm-hmm. So the district is the community of interest. That's interesting.
I mean, I think it depends on the circumstances, but if you've got a district that's been basically the same as, for the last 40 years, over time, politics are going to start to develop along those lines.
Yeah, that's interesting. Interesting observation. All right, gentlemen, anything else that you want to throw out there? Lessons learned so far as we go through this cycle, or other kind of interesting observations that you'd encourage our audience to be aware of or thoughtful about?
I think just the one thing for those that are thinking, the data just came out, or, our deadline's not till April or May, maybe we should start thinking about this. You're late.
Yeah,
the time to start this was a couple months ago, and so folks should get on the horse and start riding hard, because now is the time, without a doubt.
I think that's right. I would second that. I think that's probably the best advice at the moment.
All right. Well, the sprint is going to be on here. Oh, actually, another question real quick. So if people wanted to reach out to you and ask some questions, Chris, how do people find you?
They can go to Nielsen Merksamer website. It's nmgovlaw.com. And, my phone number's on there, my email address. Available.
You're not going to give out your Snapchat handle or anything like that, Chris?
No.
All right. Doug, how do people find you?
ndcresearch.com, or D is our website, and D Johnson at ndcresearch.com.
Okay.
And of course, if they know you, Ryder, they just call you, and everybody, so where.
That's right. That's right.
Call me. I'll hook you up. We'll get it connected. All right. Well, the sprint is on, gentlemen. The data is getting moved around the machine up in Sacramento, and will be spit out for us to start doing the critical map drawing process. The educating has begun in our communities, trying to get people ready to pounce and start drawing some maps. I appreciate your insights and observations on this critical process, and look forward to our next conversation, hopefully being maybe sometime in January, to look back on the December due dates and how that all went down, and what's next for the process. So I thank you very much for your time today. I certainly appreciate it. And that's today's report. My thanks to Doug and Chris for joining us. From the whole Public CEO team and myself, Ryder Todd Smith, thank you for your time. We hope you learned something new and inspiring that'll help you in your public service. Remember, Public CEO has a daily newsletter that is free to those who sign up at PublicCEO.com. If you have feedback, questions, or guest suggestions for Public CEO Report, please email alex@PublicCEO.com.